The Teachers Guild of New South Wales acknowledges the traditional custodians of the various lands on which we work today and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this event. We pay our respects to elders past and present of the Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters throughout Australia. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Dr. Frederick Osmond. As the President of the Teachers Guild of New South Wales, I'd like to thank you for joining us for our Guild Education Series on the topic today, the future of schooling and learning. It is my great pleasure to be joined by a distinguished panel to discuss this important education topic more broadly. Our panel this evening includes Dr. Paul Kidson, Senior Lecturer, Australian Catholic University, Dr. Hugh Chilton, the Head of Scots, the Scots College, Anna Siva, Deputy Principal, Halberry, and Megan Bennett, Director of Operations, Leppington Anglican College, and the Teachers Guild of New South Wales Counsellor, who will be moderating this event. Thank you for our panel for joining us today. For some housekeeping, please feel free to share your experiences, thoughts, and questions in the chat function, and pose any questions to the panel through the Q&A box on the webinar control panel. Please keep your Q&A questions short and relevant to the topic on what we are talking about today. Our host will moderate and will tend to ask questions during a discussion panel. Thank you, Paul, Hugh, Anna, and Megan for joining us today.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. It's wonderful to have some fantastic panelists with us to discuss this topic of the future of schooling and learning. So to begin with, I'm going to invite each of the panelists to share their backgrounds and their professional journeys by way of introduction. So we might start with you, Paul, if you'd be able to share a bit about your journey with us.
Sure, and thank you to the Guild for the opportunity to have this conversation, and to Hugh and Anna. It's just terrific. Looking forward to a great hour. I started my teaching career in the 90s. I was an English and drama teacher. I then went on to become a curriculum leader. I've worked in boarding schools, I've worked in day schools, regional, cross states, and then for 11 and a half years I was a school principal. After that, I then headed off to go and do some work in the doctoral study. I now teach at the Australian Catholic University. Part of my research is around principal health and wellbeing. Part of the Australian Principal Occupational Health, Safety and Wellbeing Project's been running for 14 years, one of the longest studies of its type, to help understand the changing nature and challenges and opportunities that school leaders face.
Great, thank you, Paul. Anna.
Hi, everybody. Anna Siva. I'm from Haileybury, which is based in Victoria and in the Northern Territory, and we have a school in Tianjin, China as well. My role at Haileybury is to look after year 5 to year 12 across all our campuses in terms of academic programs, digital, anything you can really think of. I have an absolute love of education and its ability to transform people's lives, and we do a lot of work beyond Haileybury to help advance education in this country. My career started many years ago too, and I've done lots of different roles, including pastoral, international, as well as curriculum, and have a real passion for the teaching and learning side of things, and very, very pleased to be here tonight too. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Anna. Okay, Hugh.
Well, thanks, Megan. And just echoing Paul's sentiment, and Anna, it's such a great privilege to be here tonight. And Megan, thanks for bringing us together, and Fred too. So I'd never planned to be an educator. I would call myself an accidental educator. I loved school, but kind of thought I was done with that. I thought I'd work in schools for a few years to get some experience in different sort of settings. But I think the more you're in schools, and we'd probably all concur, the more you see that, like, this is a vocation of human formation, and we're upstream of most things in the world. And so really been grabbed by that sense that this is a calling. So yeah, I've been at Scots here for a few years now and done a variety of things. I did a PhD in history and came into the school to help the school to build a research culture and think about how we could kind of reclaim our sense of not just delivering the curriculum that's produced elsewhere, but being leaders in thought and being on a journey of scholarship as well. And so led our research team and professional learning for 5 years, and it was really great to work across a really diverse range of boys, projects in Indigenous education and experiential learning, and partnerships with schools and universities. And then 2 years ago, we started a program called Scots X, which is an experimental school within a school, trying to think about how we could take what we do and flip it on its head and see if we can develop boys who are better prepared for the future. So that's been really exciting, and really looking forward to the conversation this evening.
Great, thank you, Hugh. Yeah, looking forward to hearing a bit more about that program too throughout our conversation this evening. So to start off with our first, question, what are some of the current challenges for schooling and learning that you've all experienced in your contexts? Feel free to jump in.
I'm going to jump in and say there are two distinctly different issues. Learning and schooling are two completely different constructs. We've been learning for millennia. As Fred said in his introduction in acknowledging Indigenous cultures, multi-millennia. Schooling as a formal process has a different set of questions about it. I don't think we're going to see a fundamental shift away from what the learning is. Hugh just used that beautiful phrase there. It is about human formation. Every generation needs to be raised. Every generation needs to learn how to connect with one another, how to become more fully human. Some of the content and some of the mechanisms that we do that through, and deliver some of that through, I think they're going to change quite considerably. And we've seen that through the various challenges that we had with COVID. I think as the example that Hugh's talked about from, Scots X, what's possible? Here's Anna working across multi-campuses with multi-different perspectives. I'm pretty sure that all of us here couldn't remember what we did in week 3 of term 2 in year 8, but we do remember the impact that teacher had on us, sometimes good and sometimes less so. And that speaks to the human relationality, which is going to continue to be part of what learning is about. But I think schooling is probably going to look somewhat different.
It's a good point, Paul, and I think the challenge is upon all of us to be risk takers at this time when schools can be quite traditional in their approach. And, I work in a 130-odd-year-old school, and you have to honour those traditions and values whilst being brave enough to take some risks about what schooling looks like. Obviously, teacher shortage is a massive challenge for everybody. We are also seeing an unbundling of the product. So, you can get Netflix now. People can choose where and when they do these things, and they also want to do their schooling in that way. Not everybody wants to do Saturday sport anymore, the students and the teachers alike. So I think that's a real problem for us to, or an opportunity for us to tackle. The well-being of our kids, and, teachers are frontline health workers. Many times throughout the term, and parent behaviour in many schools is also quite problematic for staff that have to deal with some of the approaches that parents make. So they're some of the things that come to mind for me when I think about the challenges afoot.
Yeah, I absolutely concur. And I think the sense of what's going on well beyond school and how that's shaping the context of what we're doing, we can't understate that. And I think that one of the biggest challenges is that we forget about, we've lost sight of that ends. And I think it speaks to a bit of what Paul was saying about the difference between schooling and learning. And it's probably not as new and dramatic a shift, but it feels like schooling has become a very technocratic thing, by which I mean a lot of our focus on how to improve schooling is about refining procedures, procedures and systems, and refining and honing a system, a machine, if you will. And often that loses sight of the purpose of education, the purpose which I think is about human formation, about helping people to know, love, and do what's true and good and beautiful in the world. And if you have that as your end, then the means by which we achieve that, we can be much more open to that. We can have a much higher risk tolerance because we've got ends in view. And I reckon that's my hunch would be that's foundational to a lot of the challenges we're seeing in schools around student engagement, achievement, even teacher attraction, retention, maybe even equity issues as well. So I think it's complex, but it goes towards perhaps a lost vision of what education's for, and a reductive view of what happens in schools.
Great, thank you, everyone. So with some of those challenges in mind, keen to really dig into what the changes have, what sort of changes have resulted in each of your contexts by way of, I guess, addressing some of those challenges.
You should go first here.
Thanks. Well, I think, what have we tried to do to address some of those challenges? I think it probably operates at a few levels. So just in our school, it's a very privileged school in many ways, 130 years old, same as Haileybury, incredible resources and so forth. But one of the things we've really tried to focus on is our purpose, our ends, and doing so to bring coherence to what we're trying to do in education. I think one of the challenges about being an educator in the world in which we live is we're hyper fractured because we're all modernists, and we believe, well, we grew up in a world which is about efficiency and segmentation, and we're hyper fractured because we're also addicted to these things, and our world is so fast, and we live in big cities with big commutes, a lot of us, and so forth. So I think the sense that the world is coming apart, the phrase that you used, Anna, about unbundling, I think the experience of being in schools for families and students and teachers can feel unbundled in quite concerning ways. So what we tried to do is to try to double down on what's the point of education in general, and education at our school in particular. And I think part of the driver of thinking about changing the model of education within our school, and it can talk about what we're doing in ScotsX and other initiatives, has started with that sense of our calling and purpose and our vision of a well-formed human being in our context. So we've done a lot of work around going back through our history and trying to mine it for stories and compelling pictures of what that looks like. One of the first things that we did in our research work was, a research team was to go back and read some of the foundational documents. And we found in those 130-year-old documents and speeches descriptions of the point of education that were very compelling today. So the moderator of the Presbyterian Church, when the school started, talked about how the school would try to adapt the mode of tuition to the peculiarities of the individual pupil. And that's in like 1893. And you think, well, we're all talking about personalization. There it is. It's everything old is new again. Teachers for whom teaching was a work of faith, a labor of love, and a patience of hope. That's compelling. I find that compelling, at least today. So I think part of the answer of addressing the things that feel very present and very fast moving is to actually take some time to think about purpose and to think about what within each of our communities, what stories there are to animate that. So that's probably at the level of intent and how a community can get around a vision for education. But I can talk a bit about some of the practical things we've done too, but I might turn to Anna and Paul before coming back to some of that.
Thanks, Hugh. So I'll talk to 2 points, I guess, the unbundling and I'll couple the digitisation with the teacher shortage question too. So obviously this is a New South Wales thing. Most of our work is in Victoria. We have 4 physical campuses, and as of last year, we opened an online school, so the first private online school in Victoria. Part of that was we made a decision. Obviously, Victoria had significant lockdowns. We learnt a lot about ourselves as a school and what we were capable of in that time. And I'm sure lots of people learn a lot about themselves and their relationships during that time too. And we decided that we wouldn't snap back and that we would do something distinctly different. And it's interesting, Hugh, that you talk about the minutes and papers that gone before us when we decided to be a parallel education provider rather than a boys' school. It says in there that Haileybury will always do something distinctly different. And so opening an online school was true to our entrepreneurial character, I guess. We were started 130 odd years ago by an entrepreneur from Haileybury in the UK. It was their alma mater. So we started Haileybury Pangea. The idea behind Pangea is about bringing the world back together through education, and we have aspirations for it to be a global product, I guess. Australia is federated, so it's very difficult in terms of getting approvals in states and territories that you don't have a physical foothold, I guess. But we knew that we were going to be disrupted in education, so we thought about disruptive innovation, and if someone was going to disrupt us, we thought we may as well do it first. So it's been the perfect storm of that Haileybury, I guess the bricks and mortar school will continue to get better while we transition this new product into the market, and we've certainly seen that. The other part about that is that we believe that education shouldn't be geographically restricted. So a lot of people tree change, sea changed. We've had students whose parents have been seconded to China and they can take their Haileybury education with them now. And the other thing is that, as I said before, lots of families want to unbundle things. They don't want to do the sport anymore. They don't want to have a commitment to different parts of the school. They just want their education delivered, and they might be an elite athlete that needs to be in training X number of hours a day and overseas for X number of days of the year. And they just need their VCE or their, numeracy and literacy delivered in a particular way. So yeah, we've ring-fenced our bricks and mortar school and our online school, and they have different price points, and students can move between them, but we don't have them in the same class because we have an expensive product, I guess, and a mid-market product there. So the other part about that I'll talk about is the teacher shortage. So we learnt during COVID too that a lot of people liked to work from home as teachers, that people really value their time post-COVID. So likewise, the kids, and many kids do want to do everything in the school, so I shouldn't minimize that at all. But the teachers don't want to be spending their weekends at work anymore. And different times in your life, if you have a baby or a sick parent, you might want to be able to be more flexible with your teaching. So we've had a number of teachers who have chosen to move into Haileybury Pangea. So we've retained great staff who've needed flexibility in their career. To give you an example, we ran a teacher open day at our on campus, and we had 200 teachers turn up. We ran it online, we had 500. And so it speaks to what the market wants in terms of flexibility of teachers. And we have a number of teachers who are hybrid, so they're on campus part of the time, so they're connected to their community, but they are also online. So I think if we think differently for our students and for our teachers, and offer different products in the market, it can be really successful at tackling some of those challenges.
Look, what they said. Let me add a few extra layers to it, though. I want to take a little bit of an out of left field, probably grenade throw, and say I still don't actually think that we've come to grips with actually what we're doing about what schools are. And I think when we shut them in COVID, we went to remote periods of learning, then we started to realise actually what their significance is. And their significance is connectivity and human connectivity. We balance that up with the fact that the PISA data that's come out this week has said we're so much online and we're having relations over time and over distance rather than proximal and the person sitting next to me. And so a lot of our kids lost some of those jostling skills of having to work out who they like and who they don't like when they have to change classes. We haven't gone back to some of those. And yet we're starting now to see in the halcyon days of, it's 16 years since we had a digital education revolution. And we are still, the Productivity Commission is saying, we're not quite sure we got the full value of the money for that. And now we're starting to see social media companies be held to account because there's actually some things that are really unpleasant that are happening. And we don't quite know the best way to reconcile that. Some schools are saying, we don't want mobile phones in the school. Oh, good on you. The stuff is still going to be happening outside of school and it's going to turn up in your school. So the restriction of the online technology is not in itself the issue. We had, those of us of a generation, wrote awful things about other human beings on the back of toilet doors. And we just sent somebody down to paint over them or to scrape them off or well, those things now stay and they can't be contained. And by the time that we get our kids that are born this year into kindergarten, Everybody will have been in an AI saturated world for some period of time. And I don't think we really quite yet know exactly what that means. It's going to have some terrifically great things. It's also going to have some unintended consequences that we start to realize maybe we need to put the genie back in the bottle if we can. Will we be able to? That, I think, speaks to some of the courage that Anna, you referred to, and that commitment to what's at the core of Haileybury, saying we will pursue things that are our own distinctive, not necessarily, banging our own drum. We've got good national educational goals, but we focus so much on the first part of the first one, which is excellence. Equity is awkward. That's really, really hard. And we're going to have really difficult conversations over the next few years because we're just going in the wrong direction about that. But we rarely speak about confident, creative, active citizens. Those are the things that are our second national goal. And we don't do much of that work because, well, frankly, it's a bit easier to be able to measure some of the stuff about excellence or not. And so those things, we've already got some frameworks there, but we need to put our shoulder to the wheel to them. I think one of the big challenges about what COVID represented, and I go a little bit further with this, what about if none of our schools existed? What would be different? What would be lost? What would be gained? Imagine there was no ACARA, and I don't tell the boss, but imagine there is no ACARA. What would you teach? Why would you teach it? How would you teach it? And what do you think its value would be? And I go right back to Hugh's comment that, we think we're remarkably modern, and yet the structure of our KLAs are thoroughly ancient. If we go back and look at the ways that a lot of our ancient Greek and Roman cultures started to look at the way that they would philosophy, aesthetics, literature, music, sport, they look remarkably like the Year 7 selection night for parents to come along and get involved with. So again, what's necessarily maybe not so new is actually old and needs to be reclaimed as part of that. So in the end, though, it was going to come down to that notion that Hugh's got, what is the end point? And the end point is building and growing and nourishing and flourishing human beings.
Here. Yeah. And if I can just build on that, Paul, like with it, how do we measure that? Like we often, you're so right that we focus on the excellence, although we don't necessarily critique what we mean by excellent often, and human excellence as opposed to, narrow measures of it that don't necessarily predict well how kids are going to go into adulthood. But we can measure other things, like we can measure connection, cohesion, the way in which students are able to, be active and engaged citizens. One of the pieces of research that I'm working on now with colleagues here and at 4 other schools and in partnership with Notre Dame University is really interesting. It's called the Form for Flourishing Study. And we've basically just frustrated that, schools like our schools and all of our schools, we know that a student is not fully formed when they're 18. You think about yourself and you're like, oh, goodness me. I'm glad there was no social media when I was 18, beyond MySpace. But the value proposition, if you want to talk about that, or the end is like, what are they like when they're 40 and what are their grandkids like in the 22nd century? And we can actually get some lead indicators on that. So this project we're working on is interviewing graduates 7 years out of school. So they're 25, the brain's basically there. They're probably still living at home, but adulthood has been reached in a lot of the markers. They might be married, they might have kids and so forth. How are they going? Are they flourishing? And doing a deep dive into that, and also marrying that up with some work we're doing with the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard around actually quantifying measures of flourishing. So we can say our purpose is not determined by the number at the end. The number has some relevance, it has some significance. I don't really have much truck with people who want to totally throw it out, because other things can replace that are not as good in some ways, but it's more than that. And we can actually work towards measuring that. What if you could say, here's the arc of formation at school in context of all the other things that shape a life. And we've got actually some good measures on how effectively that's happening. Because I think often in our schools as well, the people we put up on the posters at the end struggle they struggle as they move into adulthood, and those who have been less likely to be featured in our prospectus are the ones who come out well. So how can we understand more of that and then actually draw some through lines? So the idea that things are in the too hard basket to measure, I think we can do that, and we need to be adventurous and collaborative in pursuing that.
Just like to add before Anna comes in, we also should be thinking that about our teachers. You know, there is a lot of language around classroom ready teachers. I don't know that I've ever done a job the first time and was particularly ready to be able to do it. And I look back on myself, if I'd been the principal of what I was like as a first or second year teacher, I might have sacked myself for some of the dumb things that I did, you know, and they are themselves learning and growing. And we see too many of them bail out after 3 or 4 or 5 years after coming into the profession. And so the work that we as a profession can be doing to help settle them in, mentor them, coach them along, give them the support is equally as important, I'd suggest, Hugh, as it is for thinking, yep, our kids they're going to be growing a lot, so are our teachers.
I don't really have anything else to add other than a provocation that I like to see more teaching schools, like training hospitals, where we get more teachers doing more practical components of their degree earlier on and for longer periods of time. Would be a really interesting model to pursue. That probably happened years before I came into the profession, but you know, Teach for Australia has been successful. We've had so many great Teach for Australia teachers at Haileybury, and I think a lot of it is because they spend so much time in school learning to develop their craft.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. And I think just an example from here, we partner with 4 other Sydney schools, and now there's some of the schools in the Teaching Schools Alliance. One's in the Gold Coast and one's in the Central Coast. And there are now, I think there are at least 40 schools in Australia that are part of teaching hubs. And and select, like, recruiting people not after they've been to university, with all respect to learned friends in the academy, but recruiting them into the profession, training them on the job in context, and helping them to not just be classroom ready, but to have a deep sense of vocation and understand the context that's particular to this school, that's very different to that school, and so forth. And seeing, like in our Scots X program, when we're looking for outstanding teachers to design this new model of learning, one of our 2 core teachers had come through our teacher training school, and last year was her 2nd year as a full-time teacher, and she's redesigning the whole experience of school. So if we can create a pipeline, but also use that as a way of shifting the mental models around school, that maybe with the normal teacher training process, we get graduates coming to our schools have already been formed in a way that makes it harder to reinvent the experience of school. I think that's got a lot of promise. And there's a big study going on with UNSW on measuring the efficacy of teacher training schools. So I second that, Anna, and it's a great way as well of helping teachers to study and learn on country as well, and access and provide a better pipeline for regional, rural, and remote schools too.
It by extension flows into what we've known for some period of time about the pipeline, to use your same language, Hugh, people going into school leadership. We've got a National Teacher Workforce Action Plan because we were all really anxious about what was going on, and out of the 27 actions that were there, only 2 made reference to school principals. Our report that came out this year, a couple of years ago, we get about 2,500 people respond to it every year, which is around a quarter of the Australian school leadership population. And we saw, 19 of them said, I think I'm just about done. And then last year, that went up to 65. And then we went, what actually, if we ask them, what will they tell us? And we said, well, maybe there'll be about, 300 or 400, because they're not being asked to, they're providing this voluntarily. And when we asked them, it was over 1,250. Now, even if we discount the ones that are just worn out because it was the end of term or whatever it is, even if we lost 500, that would be a crisis, and that would shift something. That would disrupt education unbelievably so. And so now that's why there's a lot of a lather about, what can we do? Our data also shows that the 2 biggest, after the sheer volume of work and not enough time on teaching and learning, the 2 biggest sources of stress for principals now, supporting the mental health of students and supporting the mental health of teachers. And it is that holistic understanding of what education as a community is about. And if those teachers are not well, they're not going to be helping their kids who are not well. And if their principal's not well, and it's all interacting with one another. It's why we also as a profession have to be positive advocates for the vocational language that you've used on a number of occasions, Hugh. It is a great vocation to be part of. It's got demands to it. And we need to make sure that we're caring for ourselves along the line of that. It's not, you know, Anna, you've talked about the number of people re-engaging or, you know, starting to think their career prospects and opportunities differently. And that again speaks to well, what we used to do in the 90s is not going to work. So we've got to be bold and courageous and go, well, what can we be doing? Because if we see too many other people walk out the door, the ones who benefit least for that are the students and the families of our nation.
Absolutely. Some fantastic discussion there. Thank you. So thinking now, I guess, a bit more to the future, what does the future of schooling and learning look like? You've all touched on some of your experiences and shared from your own contexts, but I guess particularly in the context of traditional models of schooling and constraints such as time or the HSC, you know, what does the future look like?
I'd love it, at the risk of offending Hugh, I'd love to get kids to the end of year 12 and say, did you have a good time? Have you learned stuff that you think is really important? Off you go. But I don't know that I'm going to get any funding for my school if that's the case.
I think Paul's touched on some really important points. You know, the importance of community and relationships will transcend time, and that's the purpose of schooling in many, many ways. You know, I think so many of the things will stay the same. Like, we need to keep kids safe. We need to get them to school in many contexts. Behavior management, you know, the PISA work, Paul, you'll be so familiar with, like classroom management in Australia is woeful, and the learning loss because of that is problematic. There was a great report from Aero on that. You know, effective leadership. Paul, again, you've talked about how many leaders we're going to lose in education, but that's one of the things in the Grattan report about high excellence, high equity schools is effective leadership. And then they produced another report on multi-school organisations where they're pooling the leadership or pooling the schools with the one leader, which is what we do at Haileybury. Is, you know, we're running multiple different contexts, different campuses under the one leader, and we use a one Haileybury model. So you've got operational efficiency, but also high quality assurance across all of those campuses. So no matter where you go, you get a Haileybury experience. And I think that's a challenge for us to think about in this leadership shortage, I guess, we've got in the future. And response to interventions, you know, we've got more kids coming through with varied challenges and backgrounds and domestic violence and all sorts of things happening, and our response to those students needs to be to meet them at their need. So I haven't answered the question in terms of what a school is going to look like, but I think the challenges are ever present. And I think it's where we can, we should be thinking about things differently, which is what we're trying to do. Even on campus, where we're trying to be more flexible with our teachers when they're required on campus if they're not teaching. And we're thinking about our whole co-curricular model and choice and opportunity for students. I think if we always talk at Haileybury about being restless, that we will never be Kodak. There will never be an element of us that rests on our laurels, that we always want to be better or the best. And so we pursue that excellence vigorously, and that means you've got to be prepared to take risks and trial different things. Now, let's say Haileybury Pangaea doesn't work in 3 years' time. We can turn that tap off. It's an online school. We don't have a building we have to sell or whatever. What we will have learned through that process will make Haileybury a richer school. So I just think yeah, where you take a risk, there's enormous opportunity, even if it doesn't work out. So definitely didn't answer the question.
I want to applaud you though, Anna, because one of the things that we sometimes forget, and this is what we saw in COVID, is that schools are sometimes the best place for kids to be.
Absolutely.
Because
more often than not.
Yeah, because their home life and the relationships that they're subjected to there are really, really challenging. And I think as that balance to be struck there is, for some of those kids, remote learning was just horrifying.
And, you know, when people think about the future, they think about the shiny next tool. And, you know, everyone's been in a school where you pick a fad and you roll out this particular program, and it doesn't work. We have to be true to what we know works in schools. And I think we colour that with taking really measured risks that we think might work for the particular context that we work in. And not everybody's context is different. So, for example, our school in Darwin, we have 90 Indigenous boarders at that school that come from all sorts of different circumstances. How we operate in that context is certainly not how we operate in Brighton, in Melbourne, for example. So, you know, some of these things absolutely have to be contextual.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think, you know, who knows what the future of school is going to look like? It's in a sense, we've got to hold loosely to the future in lots of ways, but there's going to be things that are going to continue unchanged. And then we just know, I think I love what you said, Anna, about like, we kind of know what works, and we've learned particularly with functional brain imaging and so forth, and the advances in understanding neuroscience. So we've learned also there's a lot more commonality across children than there perhaps is difference between them. And again, it's a tension to manage, isn't it? Diversity of students and personalizing learning, to also the sense that there is a commonality. And there's also, coming back to Paul's comment about like, what do we want kids to learn? If we didn't have, you know, any of a car or whatever, we'd probably want to have a sense, there'd be a bit of a canon of what we think people need to know as they move out into the world. And we need to hold on to that. I just want to pick up the comment about structure, because I think often the structure of our schools is, you know, not saying anything that's not obvious, is so formative of the practices in our schools and our imagination about what school could be. And, you know, Megan, you're at a brand new school and pioneering. I've seen some of the work that you guys are doing around thinking about assessment and learning, and it's really rich. And I just wonder if into the future we need schools that are bigger, to your comment about that Gradden report, Anna, where we're not just letting every lieutenant try and figure everything out themselves, but say, you know, maybe we could pool some of those resources. It's very hard in Australia to collaborate across sectors. Very, very hard. You go to the UK where you have multi-academy trusts, you have the expectation on independent schools that they show public benefit, and there's a drive to collaborate. It's really cool. It's professional learning between schools and local areas that are very different in terms of the diversity of their resources, and the ethos enriches the whole ecosystem. So I think, you know, getting down to the weeds, things like Section 83C and so forth, we've got to get rid of those barriers to be able to collaborate. And I think independent schools should have a mandate to report on how they're working with and supporting other schools. A lot of that's already happening in great ways, but let's make that part of seeing a vision for all of education. So I think we've got to get bigger, but I reckon the future is also going to be smaller and more localized. And so, you know, if you go to the US, 2.2 million children are in micro schools there, one-room schoolhouses popping up all over the country, not just in really alternative settings or homeschooling and the like, but parents and communities who are saying, we have local needs. We think that new schools have all these things that come with them. What if we could strip some of that away and focus on the learning relationships? So I think that's a really interesting thing, and we'll see how that plays out in Australia. But bigger and scaling up things like high quality curriculum that's very accessible. So the work of OCA and so forth, making resources really accessible for people, so teachers aren't burning the midnight oil, reinventing the thing that the person teaching in the box beside them is doing, and down the road they're doing the same thing. But let's get some good resources there, but also having more ability for schools to pop up and start in areas that are underserved, and in ways that allow for high quality education to reach different communities. And I think at the moment, the barriers to doing that, to being entrepreneurial in terms of the model of school, are too many and unnecessary. Here endeth the...
Yeah. Here's the second lesson. I think the challenge to destructure or to restructure remains, and I remember years ago I had to do a combined classes across year groups, and the parents were up in arms, and they said, oh, what, you're having composite classes? And I said, every class is composite. You get a bunch of kids together, you got to work out how to put them together. We still are afflicted with the notion that all the 12-year-olds have to be together. All the 14-year-olds have to be together. And rarely do we go into, either gifted or some other type of support. And yet in our co-curricular, and indeed in some where it's safe to do, sporting codes, we don't have any great hang up about some of those. And I think there is a richness that we can be looking at that just almost seems to begin to open that genie, because what might that actually mean? Because all of us know that we put 30 12-year-olds together in the one room, you don't have an homogenous group in the least. So if we can just be honest about that, then we can start to say, well, what are the better ways that we can meet these needs, diverse and specific, personalized and grouped together? Maybe just because it's enshrined in legislation, or that could be a problem, or in some other type of instrument. Maybe we should be, as a profession, pushing back on those and saying, this is maybe not in the best interests of the way that children and young adults learn, adolescents learn.
I want to add to that, Paul, in that regulation in this country stifles innovation and education every way that I've spent so much time recently looking at legislation across Australia, and the fact that we have, a CARA, let's say we do away with it, and I'll let Derek know his job's gone after this, but we have a national curriculum, and then every state adopts and adapts that curriculum. You have 7 education ministers, and in Derek's time as chair of ACARA, this is, for anyone who doesn't know, Derek is the CEO principal of Haileybury. He's also the chair of ACARA. He has had 22 education ministers. He's been in that post for 3 years. Now, this is across the 7 states and territories. How are we supposed to get any continuity in the delivery of education and legislation in this country if the education ministers continue to churn through? And so part of my beef is that, we want to solve these really complex problems in education, and that requires us to do things differently at times, whilst, knowing what works, but we're stifled by legislation, and that, coupled with the changing nature of politicians, is really problematic, I think.
Not least of which is that all of delivery is a states and territories' responsibility. Yeah. And yet, constitutionally, trying to get the education ministers around the table is it's like herding cats. But there are 25 different systems that we have in this nation of a population of less than the population of California.
Absolutely. Some great conversation here. Thank you. I'm wondering, Hugh, are you able to dig a little bit deeper into what you've been doing at Scots X to, I guess, reimagine, re-envision schooling and learning?
Yeah, sure. So basically, we found that change is really hard. Surprise. And trying to change elements of the school experience in bits and pieces. The system, the machine, everything is optimized to stick the way it is, and to be very fragmented and structured and so forth. So all those things I said before. So we found that we had lots of little pilots going and so forth, but you want to do this excursion, or you want to change the periods here. All of those are very, very difficult for people. So we decided that we'd start a parallel experience, a kind of learning lab, to say, if we step outside a lot of those constraints, one excursion a year, create a curriculum, very, very sort of fixed assessments, and so forth. What could it look like, and what could we learn from that really quickly? A la Anna's comment about, even if the thing fails, it's still learning. So the program is for middle years boys, so year 8 boys. We started last year with just 20 boys out of 208 year group, unapologetically saying, let's start small and fail fast. And we had 50 boys apply and selected 20 that are a representative sample of the year group. This year we've got 43 out of 80 applicants, and we've got the ducks of the year to a boy who's very, very weak academically, kids with learning difficulties, a whole range of students. And it's designed around 3 principles: connection, choice, and challenge. saying we want to connect students to one another and to their teachers and adults and connect the learning together. So a lot of our learning is very thematic. It's not around sustainability and, with all respect to sustainability, but issues that are very current today. Our themes are truth, goodness, and beauty. So have some transcendence to them. And we want boys to be challenged and able to produce work they're really proud of. So all of the boys' work is exhibited for real audiences, and we want to be able to help boys to make good choices as they move through. So rather than 10 subjects and 10 different teachers and students tic-tacking between all of these different relationships, they have 2 core teachers, a bit more like primary school environment, and 3 subjects. We do a lot of project-based learning, but also a lot of mastery learning, a lot of things that are very traditional, things that are out there. And we get out into the community every Thursday for X Days. We had a great learning experience at Leppington with Megan's students on Harmony Day, where our boys were learning about the development of new cities, and got to partner with some students there. So yeah, very experiential, very relational, and lifting the bar on achievement at that critical stage of early adolescence, where, yeah, coming back to your point, Paul, 12-year-olds, these are 13, 14-year-olds, and the spectrum is enormous. So how can we help create a relational environment where we can see and know that, and tailor the experience to each student?
Great, thank you, Hugh. And it's going to be interesting to see how that continues on throughout the years ahead with that program, and similarly with you, Anna, in Haileybury and the online school there. Now, we've had some questions come through as people have registered for this webinar, so we've got a little bit of time to dig into them. But if you do have any questions, please feel free to put them into the Q&A or into the chat, and we'll endeavour to get to them in our remaining 10 minutes or so that we have together. AI is obviously a big one that's been a bit of a disruptor in education in the last couple of years. And Paul, you did touch on AI before, but where do you see AI as, playing a role, in schools and with learning in the time ahead? Oh, sorry, Paul, I think you might still be muted there. Not sure what's happening there. Anna, did you want to jump in some of your reflections about AI?
I guess I think about this in multiple ways. So, for example, we've just got Copilot, and I'm thinking about how it can make me 30% more efficient is my goal. And that's not so I can do more work, it's so that I can work less, because I think as teachers and educators, we spend so much of our time working late nights, etc. So I'm doing a lot of thinking about how Copilot can help me be more efficient and my teams be more efficient, that alongside ChatGPT. We, as a school, whilst there are absolutely things that we need to be cautious about, we have, policies for our students. As soon as ChatGPT was launched last year, like many schools, we have a traffic light system of when it's appropriate to be used, that we absolutely want students. I think there's the challenge around when you're in a room with people, the people who are often the cleverest ask the best questions, and the prompts that you put into AI can often elicit better responses. So that's really important, I think. We also have done we obviously have a very strong digital backbone. All of our courses are built on Canvas. There's a heap of digital content and video content in there. So we have a studio at one of our sites where you can just walk in, hit a foot pedal, record, and then it gets sent back to you. And there's somebody who will edit it for you. But that costs about 80 grand to set up. In the future, you can have your face and type in what you want you to say, and that same content will be produced. So we have Professor Beacon in one of our courses that is purely AI. So yeah, I think a lot of it is about efficiencies for our very busy staff, but also, helping our students make good decisions about what's real and what's not. We know that is really problematic, and so there's a lot to be done in that space, I think, for our kids.
Apologies for the tech issue. And I'm just going to bounce off that fabulous last comment from Anna. I think the major challenges are not that it's shiny and not that it's amazing, but that is there's a paper in 2021 with a beautiful title. It's a stochastic parrot. It just predicts what you think it wants to say, and then it says it, but that's not a meaningful, intelligible conversation. It's the same way that I am constantly having to say, oh, I'm sorry, autocorrect, I didn't mean to say that. You know, those sort of predictive models are one of the areas. And to pick up on Anna's comment, it's about helping kids understand that's actually not creativity, it's replication. And so there's a distinction to be made there. That I could go on for some period of time. I won't for the sake of it. But the issues around the ethics, the issues around how these models are trained on the work of other people who are not given a due recognition of that speaks to any number of ethical issues, regardless of then we start to talk about the sustainability of the sheer volume of consumption of energy that's required to drive them. There are big things. And I think going to a lot of our adolescents now, those things are really important to them. Those things are really important to them. But if we don't actually articulate them, then I think we are derelict in our own duty.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think, you know, that the way we use AI, for better or worse, and you see amazing examples of that, is very different to a 12-year-old's. Like when I think about using AI to refine my questioning or think about how I could improve a report, like I've actually built that background knowledge, those skills, those ways of thinking that I come to the tool with. But it's very concerning when a 12-year-old doesn't have that. And it's a bit like the whole digital native thing. It's like just because you grow up using something doesn't mean you know how to use it well. So yeah, I feel it's you know, there's talk about one of the issues is how do we avoid AI de-skilling teachers around the things that teachers are really good at. Like we tried to do a lot of reports in our little ScotTex team using AI, like using Gemini last term. And we all just looked at each other and went, this is probably taking more time and it doesn't sound like me and there's massive prompts. And we're just like, let's just do that ourselves because that's human judgment. And we're actually pretty good at that. I think with kids too, like how do we avoid them? It makes things so frictionless. If you get used to living in a frictionless world, you're in big trouble. So I'm really interested in like, how could you have, like, could you see a school that uses AI really well, but also has kids reading old books and writing beautiful short sentences? And like, is there a way of doing both? The classical schooling movement's really interesting. It's kind of having a bit of a heyday in the States, and it's emerging here. And I'd be interested to see how that develops here, because the ability to pay attention is going to be an even more precious human skill, and we're at risk of getting rid of that because of our the appeal of frictionless.
Absolutely. Thank you. We might finish up with one final question, and this is another one that's been submitted, and that's, where do you see micro-credentials playing a role in schools looking to the future?
Go, Paul.
I'll jump. I think they're going to be really valuable. Teachers already, we've talked about the time issues, the challenges, the stresses, and the ability to you know, stack stuff together, small short courses that then articulate into larger courses, that then articulate into larger, you know, diplomas, degrees, whole degrees. And, you know, I speak from a biased lens. That's what we've been doing over the last little bit at my joint, but plenty of others are as well, because they recognize that if there's going to be benefit, it's from the teacher's perspective to say, it's worth me turning up and doing this because I can manage this little bit. I can't manage to sign up for 4 years for a postgraduate degree. I don't even know what I'm doing next month. And so I think that will become much more powerful. And it goes back to the Teaching Schools Alliance idea that a better integration between the academy and schools is desperately needed in so many areas.
I agree. I think there are some challenges with micro-credentials with kids. I'm not well versed in this, but I'm pretty sure some of them cannot be used below 13, for example, because of child safety and the data that they carry, etc. And Paul, you will probably know that better than I, but I know Canvas has a micro-credentialing platform and we have to get certain permissions for students at different ages. And I think like anything in schools, it's not the tool, but it's why you are trying to do that that is most important. And there are a lot of things that you need to build after the why, and micro-credentialing is no different. So you need a framework for that. How are you going to tag it? What's going to be associated with it? How are you going to assess it? Because we could badge everything and then it doesn't have meaning. So it has to be meaningful and purposeful and really be strongly connected to your why. And yeah, the tool doesn't matter so much.
Yeah, I think I don't know if I've got anything profound to say to that. We haven't done anything in micro-credentialing here. We're just in the watch and wait and see piece, because I think we've watched a number of schools who've done a lot of work around it, and then you see national frameworks come out and you think, oh, was that, when's the right time to bring things in, because there's so many things we could do. I think the work that Haileybury X and Anna and your team have done is really leading the way in that area. I guess I'm just curious about what happens as things become more and more micro. Do they lose their coherence? And so how do you help children and into adulthood have a sense of how the parts fit together? And maybe it's better to have fewer things, at greater depth than a whole swag of bits and pieces. Now, that's a simplistic way of putting it, but I just wonder about the desire to build up a as diverse a portfolio as possible to sell yourself. And if we go down the path of the US and think about different ways of getting to university, and all of a sudden children have to show their whole portfolio and their personal resume when they're 16, 17 about why you should, then my concern would be that they end up with a whole lot of stuff that they don't know how it fits together and how it points towards what it means to flourish as a human being. So again, question about what it's for, as Anna said, is critical.
And the only other thing I'll add to that, and I know we're about to finish up, is that I agree with micro-credentialing in some things, but I know people are time poor, particularly educators, but there is something about demonstrating capacity to do something that is really challenging that's important. And if I'm going to employ the next aspirational leader at Haileybury, I want them to have demonstrated capacity. And I think being able to work and to challenge yourself with an MBA or a master's degree in something else demonstrates capacity in the prospect. And I think that's really important for us to not lose sight of.
All right, well, thank you so much, Anna and Hugh and Paul, for some fantastic conversation this evening. That hour together has just gone so quickly. But I'll now hand back to Fred to formally conclude our webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Megan. And on behalf of the Teachers Guild of New South Wales, I'd like to thank our distinguished panel, Paul, Hugh, and Anna, for their wonderful initiatives, expertise, leadership, and dedication in engaging us all on our very informative discussion and the opportunities and challenges on our important topic today. The Teachers Guild of New South Wales thanks everyone for joining our webinar and congratulates our amazing educators on the work all have been leading in making education the vibrant professional association that it is. Thank you. Just in terms of follow-up, the event recording will be sent out along with a certificate of attendance and a short post survey to help us shape our future online webinars. Thank you again for joining our event, and we look forward to seeing you at future Guild events. Please stay safe and well, and thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Megan, Fred, Paul, and Anna.